Bugatti spent years building an image no one dared to question. Matt Armstrong questioned it anyway, and the internet took sides fast. But while that controversy was still echoing across forums and comment sections, a different company was watching quietly. Koenigsegg, the Swedish hypercar maker known for engineering that defies physics, made a move nobody predicted. Not a response. Not a reaction. Something far more deliberate, and the full story behind it is stranger than the headline suggests. The video didn't start with accusations. It started with a car. Matt Armstrong, a mechanic-turned-creator with 3.1 million subscribers, received a Bugatti Chiron at his workshop for what should have been a routine inspection. What he found wasn't routine. The car showed signs of prior damage that had not been disclosed at the point of sale. Armstrong documented everything, methodically, on camera, without theatrics. He laid out the findings piece by piece, let the evidence speak, and posted it. Within 72 hours, the video had crossed 4.2 million views. The response from the public was immediate. Comment sections fractured. Forums lit up. Automotive media, which had largely avoided confronting hypercar brands directly, was suddenly forced to engage. Bugatti released a statement, carefully worded, pointing responsibility toward the specific dealer involved rather than any systemic issue. The brand never directly addressed the technical findings Armstrong had documented. That silence was noticed. 3 automotive legal analysts, cited separately by Car Throttle and Auto Vista Group, pointed to something bigger underneath the surface noise. The situation, they argued, had exposed a structural gap in how hypercars are inspected and disclosed before sale. These aren't mass-market vehicles. A Bugatti Chiron carries a base price north of $3 million. At that price point, buyers operate on trust that the product matches its represented condition. Armstrong's video raised the question of whether that trust was being systematically managed rather than genuinely earned. The story had staying power because Armstrong had credibility. He wasn't an outsider speculating. He was a working mechanic with a documented track record, showing his findings in real time, on camera, with no editorial filter. Most coverage focused on the drama between Armstrong and the dealer. Most coverage missed the part that mattered more. Roughly 1,500 kilometers north of Bugatti's headquarters in Molsheim, France, in a small Swedish town called Ängelholm, a very different kind of car company had taken note. They weren't preparing a response. They were preparing something else entirely, and what they decided to do next had no precedent in the hypercar world. Armstrong's video sparked a debate that's still dividing the car world. Whose side are you on, and do you think hypercar brands owe buyers that level of transparency? Drop your answer below. To understand why Koenigsegg did what it did, you first have to understand what Koenigsegg actually is. In 1994, a 22-year-old Swede named Christian von Koenigsegg decided he wanted to build the perfect sports car. He had no automotive engineering degree, no factory, no industry connections. What he had was a former Swedish Air Force base in Ängelholm and a level of technical obsession that most people in the industry would have called unrealistic. 30 years later, that obsession had become one of the most respected names in hypercar engineering on the planet. The numbers alone tell an unusual story. Koenigsegg has never produced more than 40 cars in a single year. Not because of limitations, because of choice. Every vehicle is hand-assembled by a small team that treats each build as an individual project rather than a production unit. Some models carry base prices exceeding $3 million, placing them in the same financial territory as Bugatti. But the culture inside the company looks nothing like a traditional luxury brand. Christian von Koenigsegg is not a figurehead. He appears regularly in technical deep dives, unscripted factory walkthroughs, and interviews where engineering questions get real answers, not press-approved talking points. According to a 2022 profile in Robb Report, the brand has deliberately avoided the kind of aloof corporate positioning that most luxury competitors treat as a feature. Accessibility, for Koenigsegg, is not a marketing strategy layered on top of the product. It is woven into the identity of the company itself. That culture didn't happen by accident. It reflects a specific belief that Christian has spoken about openly, that technical honesty, sustained over time, builds deeper trust than carefully managed mystique ever could. Bugatti's mystique had just taken a very public hit. Koenigsegg's response to that moment wasn't reactive. It was consistent with 30 years of operating a completely different way. And that consistency is exactly what made their next move so significant. The Bugatti story had barely finished trending when something unexpected landed in Matt Armstrong's inbox. It wasn't a legal notice. It wasn't a PR pitch. According to Armstrong himself, speaking during a live stream in early 2025, the message came from the top of the company. Not filtered through an agency. Not passed along by a publicist. Direct contact, from Koenigsegg, with an offer that Armstrong said he had not seen from any manufacturer at that level before. The precise wording of that initial communication has never been made fully public. What Armstrong did confirm, in a February 2025 community post that received over 14,000 likes, was the nature of what was being offered. Access. Real access. Not a press day with a handler in every room and a list of approved questions. Not a staged drive on a closed track with a brand representative narrating the experience. Koenigsegg was offering Armstrong the opportunity to engage with their facility and their vehicles with no editorial restrictions attached. That is not how this industry operates. Most hypercar manufacturers manage media relationships through tightly structured embargo agreements. Journalists and creators are given curated experiences, specific talking points, and clear boundaries around what can and cannot be shown. The product is always presented in its most favorable context. Access is a controlled variable, not a gesture of openness. Koenigsegg's offer inverted that model entirely, and the timing made it impossible to ignore. This was happening in the direct aftermath of a situation where a competitor's brand had been damaged precisely because the gap between polished presentation and documented reality had become visible to millions of people. Christian von Koenigsegg had addressed this philosophy directly 4 years earlier. In a 2021 interview with Top Gear magazine, he said that if someone truly understands what Koenigsegg builds and why they build it, there is never any need to manage the story. The product, the process, and the people speak for themselves. Whether the outreach to Armstrong was a calculated repositioning move or a genuine expression of that philosophy is a question worth sitting with. The answer is probably that it was both, and that at Koenigsegg, those two things have never been in conflict. What Armstrong found when he actually walked through that factory, that's the part most coverage skipped entirely. If you want the version without the PR filter, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is here for. But what happened when Armstrong arrived raised a question neither side had fully prepared for. What Armstrong found when he actually walked into that factory, that's the part most coverage skipped entirely. If you want the version without the PR filter, subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is here for. Armstrong arrived in Angelholm with a camera crew and no script. Koenigsegg had no script either. What followed was documented across a multi-part series that began publishing in early 2025. The footage didn't open with a glamour shot of a car on a turntable. It opened with the factory floor, workers mid-assembly, components laid out, processes visible and uninterrupted. Armstrong moved through it the same way he moves through any workshop. He looked at things closely. He asked the questions that occurred to him. Nobody redirected him. The centerpiece of the visit was a Jesko Absolute. For context, this is a car with a theoretical top speed of 330 miles per hour, a global production run capped at 125 units, and a price tag sitting at approximately $3 million per vehicle. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most extreme road-legal machines ever built. Armstrong was shown one in active assembly. Not a finished showroom model. An actual car in the process of being built. He spoke directly with the engineers working on it. Not with communications staff translating their answers. The engineers themselves, discussing tolerances, specifications, and quality thresholds in real numbers, with real candor. There were no PR handlers in the frame. There was no moment where someone stepped in to soften a question or redirect a line of inquiry. One segment from the series crossed 2.1 million views on its own. It focused on Koenigsegg's quality check process, the specific steps taken before any component is signed off and moved to the next stage of assembly. Armstrong didn't narrate it dramatically. He just showed it. And then, without making it the explicit point of the video, He noted that the process he was watching stood in direct contrast to what he had documented during the Bugatti situation. The comment sections across both videos told the story. Viewers weren't just responding to Koenigsegg positively. They were recalibrating their expectations of what transparency at the hypercar level could actually look like. The contrast hadn't been staged for the camera. It had emerged from the footage itself, organically, because the two situations were genuinely different. But inside that factory, one detail sat quietly in the background of several shots. Something that didn't make it into the headlines. Something that explained, more than anything else, why Koenigsegg had made this move at this particular moment. Goodwill is not a strategy on its own. And inside the hypercar world, what Koenigsegg did carried real risk. Industry observers familiar with boutique manufacturer communications, people who work adjacent to these brands without being employed by them, noted that the decision to open the Angel Home facility to Armstrong was not unanimous internally. The concern wasn't about Armstrong's character or his credibility. It was about the nature of uncontrolled access itself. A single misunderstood specification, documented on camera and published to millions of subscribers, can generate a news cycle that no correction ever fully reverses. A finding taken out of context, even an honest mistake, lands before the clarification does. At that point, the damage is already distributed. Traditional media relationships exist partly to manage that exposure. Embargo agreements, approved imagery, supervised test drives, these aren't just about brand image. They are risk containment tools. Koenigsegg had voluntarily set those tools aside. Most people have dealt with a version of this, a company that looked trustworthy until something cracked the surface. If that's ever happened to you, you already understand why this story resonated with so many people. What justified that decision was a shift that had been building for several years and had become impossible to ignore by 2024. According to data cited in a Reuters analysis of automotive media fragmentation, between 2022 and 2024, 5 of the top 10 most watched automotive YouTube channels had surpassed the viewership of their print media equivalents. The audience had moved. And crucially, the trust had moved with it. Maybe you've seen this happen in your own world. An institution that held authority for decades suddenly finding that the people it used to influence had simply stopped listening to it and started listening to someone else entirely. Koenigsegg had read that shift clearly. Engaging Armstrong on Armstrong's terms wasn't a gesture of goodwill dressed up as strategy. It was a direct acknowledgement that the institutions which had previously controlled automotive brand narratives no longer held that power exclusively. The question was whether the product could hold up under genuinely unfiltered scrutiny. Koenigsegg believed it could. The early numbers supported that belief. Across Armstrong's Koenigsegg content in its first month of publication, combined impressions reached 47 million. That figure didn't come from a paid campaign. It came from footage of a factory, engineers answering questions, and a quality check process shown without editing for comfort. The math was already working. But the broader implications of what Koenigsegg had done were only beginning to register across the rest of the industry. The results didn't take long to show up in the data. According to social listening data aggregated by Automotive Social Index in March 2025, Koenigsegg's brand sentiment score among automotive enthusiasts aged 18 to 34 rose by 34 percentage points in the weeks following Armstrong series. That demographic had previously shown low brand familiarity with Koenigsegg, not because the cars weren't remarkable, but because the brand had existed largely outside the media channels that generation actually consumed. One content series, built on unfiltered factory access, had moved that number more than years of traditional positioning had managed. But the more significant development wasn't about Koenigsegg's own numbers. Motor One reported that 2 other low-volume hypercar manufacturers had entered early-stage discussions with independent automotive creators for similar access arrangements. Neither brand was named publicly, but the direction was clear. The Bugatti situation had identified a vulnerability that the entire segment shared, the gap between curated brand presentation and the kind of documented reality that a credible creator with a camera could expose. Koenigsegg had demonstrated one way to close that gap before it became a crisis. The underlying logic was straightforward and difficult to argue with. A single YouTube mechanic had reached 4.2 million viewers in 72 hours with a video about one car. Most hypercar manufacturers spend that kind of reach across an entire annual media budget, across multiple platforms, with carefully managed messaging. The arithmetic of opacity had changed. Staying closed was no longer a neutral position, it was an increasingly expensive one. For decades, exclusivity had functioned as its own form of protection in this world. The less access people had, the less opportunity there was for scrutiny. That model had worked when the media landscape was controllable. It was no longer controllable. Koenigsegg hadn't just responded well to a competitor's bad moment. It had identified where the industry was heading and positioned itself on the right side of that shift before most others had acknowledged the shift existed. The hypercar world was changing. And one small factory in a Swedish town had just shown the rest of the industry what the new model looked like. But Koenigsegg isn't the only brand quietly repositioning right now. There's another name, one far older and far more guarded, that's been watching all of this unfold. That story is next.